The Vince McMahon Netflix documentary has been released, and with it, answers to some of the most pressing questions we as wrestling fans have had about the most impactful, important, and quite frankly, indefensible figure in the history of not only WWE, but all of pro wrestling. The Vince McMahon documentary spans 6 episodes on Netflix, and it got into essentially everything that one would need to know about the man. We're going to talk about it. I'm going to tell you the biggest moments, takeaways, episode by episode, everything you need to know right here in this video. But first, be sure to smash that like button, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And a warning, things that are going to be discussed in this video do have to do with the allegations of assault that Vince McMahon was hit with a couple of years ago. So viewer discretion is advised in that respect. But one of the biggest questions about the documentary was, how was it going to weave this tale? And we found out pretty early on that it was going to do so by first telling the story of Vince at an early age. Episode 1 of this docuseries focused on the early life and rise of Vince McMahon, someone who was raised by his mother and a stepfather who did not know his biological father until the age of 12, that being Vincent J. McMahon, or Vince Sr., as he's more often known. And Vince Sr. had a way about him. He was the leader, founder, well, not founder, but he was in charge of the then WWF, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, that would go on to become the World Wrestling Federation. And Vince tells this story to start off the documentary that at an early age, at the age of 12, I believe, when he first met his father, he went up to him and expected to get a hug. Vince ran up to him, arms out, ready to hug his father for the first time, and instead his dad just gives him a nice pat on the back. And it starts this theme of like having to earn your love as a child. And it's something that, obviously stuck with Vince at that early age, but it's also something that we see come up later on when in terms of Shane and Stephanie McMahon, the children of Vince. So there's so much to get into in that respect that we will, but the story goes, and the story that the docuseries focuses on is that of Vince's rise. And after, initially meeting his father takes him under his wing. They go into business together after Vince spends a couple of years as an announcer. He goes on and says, well, Dad, I'm going to buy out your company. I want to buy the WWF. And Vince Sr. kind of scoffed at this seemingly at first, but as Vince McMahon says, he then made an agreement with his father that he will buy the WWF from his dad through 3 payments. He will buy it out from him and the shareholders. And the payments, if they were missed at any point, then Vince's dad not only got to keep the company, but he also got to keep the money as well. So obviously there was a lot riding on Vince's success. And the way that Vince tells the story is that if he had missed the payment, it would have been over. But he was able to make those payments just based off of the revenue they were generating over time doing the wrestling business. Vince actually was able to kind of take control of the finances and then use the money that he would make on the road to pay off this massive expense of buying the company. So that deal worked out, and it seemed to have instilled a sense of pride in McMahon, as he even discussed in this docuseries. And as that happened, they also tell the story of the territories and Vince McMahon taking over the territories. And for those of you who are wondering, back in the day, wrestling used to be broken up in regional territories, and every single region had their turf. Every single company had their part of the country and were not really allowed to impede on each other. And that was kind of what made the National Wrestling Alliance so big, and the NWA World Championship mean something, because it was all these bodies coming together to decide who is the big champion. But Vince did something that was unprecedented, and he did something that his father did not like. Vince McMahon said that he took the company from his dad and immediately began invading the territories. And he would go to these territories, go to their biggest stars, offer them money, and then he began to nationalize professional wrestling and By professional wrestling, I mean WWE. So that's where USA Network came in. USA Network was launched, and WWF on USA was launched, and it became a more national brand. And as this was happening, as the stars of all the territories were going away, you saw WWE stock going up, while other territories like the AWA, like Georgia Championship Wrestling, Jim Crockett Promotions, and others were on the wayside and were eventually forced to go out of business. And this is a part of the docuseries that kind of resonated with me, because I'm someone who always believes the notion that Vince McMahon, by doing this, was not someone who did what was best for business necessarily, but he did what was best for his business. The industry was not thriving because of what Vince did. WWE, WWF was thriving. And that's like a very important kind of distinction to make. We can sit here and say and agree that WWE became the biggest thing in professional wrestling. It became synonymous with professional wrestling. It became a global enterprise. I will never challenge, fight, or disagree with that fact. It is a fact. Vince McMahon turned WWE into a global juggernaut. However, to claim that he turned professional wrestling into a global juggernaut, to claim that Vince McMahon saved professional wrestling, to claim that Vince McMahon did what was best for the industry, is probably the biggest load of shit that I have ever heard. That was part of the pro WWE side in this documentary, kind of spinning that narrative as WWE has done in the past. However, it's just untrue. And one thing I wish we saw was, I wish they would have covered more about the impact that the move of nationalizing the WWF at the time did to these local companies. And not only local companies, but the wrestlers. At the end of the day, back in the 1980s, the mid-1980s, when this happened, the fact of the matter is Vince could only get so many wrestlers from all of these different territories, and he could only highlight so many of them on TV. And once that happened, when he got enough to fill up his wrestling program and the other companies began going out of business, that left a lot more wrestlers without jobs. That left a lot more wrestlers in these different territories without the ability to wrestle. It left so much money on the table, not only for these companies, but for the people in these regions that wanted to become wrestlers. And it hurt the industry in that respect. And I wish that aspect of it was discussed more in this documentary. I totally understand this is a profile of Vincent Kennedy McMahon. However, that was something that I believed should have been and could have been delved into more. And Vince, honestly, quite frankly, should have been pressed on more. And obviously, Vince was a part of this. All of his interviews took place prior to the June 2022 resignation and allegations that came out. So this has been a project that has been in motion for a long time. I just wish they would have pressed him on this. The other thing that we saw was, as WWE was going through this boom period, we saw more and more growth. We saw more and more co-branding. Hulk Hogan going on late night TV. Vince McMahon being on Letterman, being a correspondent at one point for the Letterman show. And that showed how big professional wrestling was growing, and it was becoming more and more part of the zeitgeist. And that was the vision that Vince McMahon had. That's why he never believed in professional wrestling. He believed what he was doing and what wrestling should be was sports entertainment. And as Tony Atlas even said in this docuseries, he believed, and everyone else in the backstage area at WWE believed, Vince was kind of crazy for thinking that, because it had been done in one way for so long. It had been done in a way that kept up the mystique, the aura of professional wrestling, but was grounded in its roots that were, more of a sports athletic contest. But Vince made it, into a more spontaneous and charismatic product. And that's what ended up happening. That was the vision he had. And it was successful. You cannot deny that. Documentary then goes on to talk about Vince and his dad's feeling about this. And this is an interesting thing, because one of the things that we know from history is that Vince McMahon Sr. did not appreciate Vince going into the territories. He passed away shortly before WrestleMania 1, I believe. And one of the things that he was alleged to have done was, just lambast Vince for this move and feel like he was essentially taken advantage of, because it's, again, alleged that Vince and his dad had a handshake agreement that Vince would never nationalize the WWF. And immediately after purchasing it and getting the rights to the company away, that is what he began doing. And regardless of that, Vince does tell a story in this docuseries that his father, right before his death, came up to him and said, "You know, son, I love you. I'm proud of you." And to quote Vince McMahon to the rest of the territories, "Fuck him." That is what Vince McMahon alleges his father said. Tony Atlas contested these things very strongly, but at the end of the day, it is kind of a he said, she said situation. I'm not going to speak to whether or not that conversation with Vince's dad happened, but one thing we do know is that Vince's dad was very much against the idea of nationalizing, because it was going against the other promoters, and I think even he understood what it meant for the overall industry. WWF, WWE would have been a healthier, bigger juggernaut of a product, but at the end of the day, would not have been good for the industry. But regardless of that, professional wrestling continued to grow. We saw the boom of Hulkamania. They told the story of Hulk Hogan's rise from a heel to then being the world champion going into WrestleMania 1. A lot of this is stuff that we kind of already knew, and much of the documentary, honestly, if you are a fan of professional wrestling, you kind of already knew. There were a few different tidbits that were interesting. The main draw, though, was the insight that you got from various different characters throughout Vince's tenure in WWE. One of the quotes about Vince McMahon, or one of the stories, I should say, about Vince McMahon that really tickled me was going into WrestleMania 1, before he came up with the idea. He went on vacation because his wife had convinced him to go on vacation, and came back 2 days later, got on the phone, and told everyone, "We're going to have a Super Bowl type event one time a year, and it's going to be called WrestleMania." And Vince McMahon said this about, the national expansion, the WrestleMania, all that kind of stuff. He said the following quote: "I don't know if it was good for the industry, but it was good for me and my organization," which, again, goes back to my original point about the territory days and Vince McMahon nationalizing and why it was so dangerous. At the end of the day, we can talk about whether or not it was the smart business move and it's a cutthroat business. At the end of the day, it doesn't have to be. That is a certain way of going about it that I think does lead to, as we've seen, lulls in business, because in the industry, because WWE can be going up and have great business, have great stuff, but if they're not competing with other people, if they are not being held to a standard, if they are the standard and, they control how low that standard can be. And as we've seen in years of WWE not having competition, it does not bode well for that standard. So that is, again, part of a larger gripe I have with the narrative that WWE or made professional wrestling bigger. Not true. The next thing they talk about is pro wrestling going prime time. I did talk about earlier, Vince on Letterman, Hogan on these nightly shows. One part of this that kind of got into the more scandalous aspects of it were things like the David Schultz incident, where David Schultz attacked, slapped, whatever you want to say, a reporter who called pro wrestling fake. You also had Hulk Hogan choking out a talk show host on TV, which started this rap of professional wrestling, being too rough for the prime time, too rough for the mainstream. And I think things like that and actions like that really did lead to pro wrestling being kind of thrown to the wayside, and that's why you didn't see a lot of reporters outside of the dirt sheets like Meltzer and others really talk about pro wrestling and cover it in a serious way. You never saw the New York Post, the New York Times, Washington Post, or ESPN, whatever. You never saw them go out and report on pro wrestling in a very serious manner back then, and I think this perception, these incidents did play a role into that. But there was one person who did, and that was that was Phil Muchnick, and we will talk about Phil Muchnick later on in this program. But before I do that, and before we talk about episode 2, be sure to smash that thumbs up, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, And let's talk about episode 2. So, episode 2 focuses on the scandals leading up to the steroid trial, as well as some of the earlier allegations against Vince McMahon. And in addition to speaking about WrestleMania 3 and the boom of the WWF, obviously there's the conversation about how many people were there. Vince and Hogan in the doc say that there were somewhere around 93,000 people in the building for WrestleMania 3. Hogan tells this insane story, and Vince backs it up, which I could not believe, of Hulk Hogan and Andre calling it in the ring, brother, and Hogan didn't know whether or not he's going to lose, which I'm going to call BS on that. It is what it is. There's no evidence, even if you watch the match, to say that that is true. But regardless, even if you take it at its word, kind of insane. But Meltzer was also interviewed for the doc. He combated that 93,000 number. Regardless of that, the real number is estimated to be somewhere in the 80,000 people range, which is an insane amount of people to attend a wrestling show. But people are still going to talk about it. What I do want to talk about, though, is something that was covered here that genuinely surprised me. And that was in the 1980s, Jesse the Body Ventura attempted to unionize the WWE and the WWE wrestlers. This is a move that was very controversial at the time because, as we know, WWE is a very cutthroat business. Vince McMahon is not someone who is prone to give wrestlers things that he doesn't necessarily need to give them. And unionization is a way of kind of forcing WWE's hand. That's one of the things about unions. Unions are able to negotiate on behalf of staff, on behalf of employees, on behalf of these workers who are marginalized and whose needs are not being met, in order to advocate for them and ensure that they are being held to a standard in terms of the benefits and other things that they are given as part of the deal for working for a company. And that's where we get into this idea of wrestlers being independent contractors versus employees, and there's a whole different battle there. But in the 80s, Jesse the Body Ventura, who went on to become the governor of Minnesota at the time, was a commentator and started to have discussions with other wrestlers about unionization. And they tell the story in the doc, like, this is a business where you're on the road 300 plus days a year, 7 days a week, 52 weeks out of the year. You are not seeing your family. You are not home. You are not there for Christmas, all these different events. You are missing out on your children growing up. And on top of that, there is a need as a pro wrestler to wrestle hurt. And you're doing this because if you don't wrestle while hurt, your paycheck is not guaranteed. You are not going to get paid if you are injured and at home. And that's how the business was in the 80s. And it's slightly different now, and it's better now in a lot of ways, obviously, because of the guaranteed money. But at the end of the day, in the 80s, this was not the case. So Jesse Ventura tried to unionize, and I could not believe it because Hogan admitted it, and this shows you where Hogan's politics lie. Hogan admitted to union busting for Vince McMahon. I have in my notes, fuck Hulk Hogan. Stand by it. Fuck Hulk Hogan. Vince McMahon said that the unionization attempt was a sham and believes that no one in the locker room would get behind Jesse, to which Tony Atlas said, Vince said if people show up to the union meeting, then they will be fired. So, union busting, part of the many, many evil faces of Vince McMahon as someone who is very pro-union and who is part of a union. Yeah, fuck Vince McMahon for that. But regardless, that was one of the many things that were discussed as far as the controversies, and the first of many controversies in this. However, we have to cover the first real big one that everyone kind of knows about, that being the steroid trial. And the steroid trial with Dr. Zahorian was always built up by WWE to be something that the government was coming after Vince McMahon. And at the time, as it stated in the documentary, the Reagan administration had gone hard on drugs. There had been the war on drugs, and steroids had been classified as, I believe, a Schedule 3 drug, in which case, if you were buying and not getting prescribed steroids and you were buying them, that would be illegal. And the argument that was being made by the government was that Dr. Zahorian, who was a WWE or a state athletic commission sanctioned doctor by Pennsylvania for WWE, was essentially abusing that rule of prescription. He was over-prescribing steroids for purposes that they were not medically needed for. And part of that was these guys backstage in WWE, because remember, as I said before, you're on the road 300 days a year. You need to wrestle to be fit. You need to wrestle hurt. You need to be fit in order to be on TV and be looked at by Vince McMahon as someone who deserves to be on TV. These were not the wrestlers of the 1970s who were, kind of like thick, burly men who had a little bit of a belly but were strong, like kind of farmer strong. These were bodybuilders, superheroes, cartoon characters come to life. And part of the deal there was everyone at the time was kind of taking steroids. And this got into the Arsenio Hall incident, where Hulk Hogan went on the Arsenio Hall show, and it's an infamous incident where he essentially goes out there and lies about not using steroids. He admitted to taking steroids earlier in his career, but he had never done it under the Vince McMahon WWE banner, which is a lie. Vince told him not to do that. Vince told him to actually go on the show and admit to taking steroids. However, instead, Hogan does what Hogan does best. It's a work, brother, because he lied. And that was something that I think many fans did not know, unless you're really like in the weeds of the kind of stuff. It was chronicled in Vice's steroid trial documentary on the Dark Side of the Ring series, so go check that out for more information. But in addition to this, they did go also into other scandals. And, they talked about Vince during this trial and the way that he perceived himself as the victim, and he also portrayed himself as the victim. But on top of that, they got into more serious allegations against Vince McMahon that would kind of foreshadow the demise of his career. First, they discussed the infamous Ring Boy scandal, which I know is something that many wrestling fans don't typically hear about. We're familiar with the steroid scandal, but the Ring Boy scandal is genuinely one of the most under-talked about and under-discussed horrific incidents in wrestling history. But essentially, Mel Phillips was an employee for the WWF, worked as an official in the WWF, and he, along with two others, including Pat Patterson, were accused to have abused ring boys. And usually these were teenagers who were setting up the rings at these local shows, and he was accused to have abused them in horrific ways, and these were underage boys, many of them as well. So this obviously was something that kind of permeated down and people knew about. Bret Hart calling Mel Phillips a pedophile. Pat Patterson and Terry Garvin, who was the other person involved, were also implicated. According to Dave Meltzer, Vince specifically told him that one of the three was innocent, and that was Pat Patterson, to which Tony Atlas, right afterwards in this documentary, says Pat would actually go and grab him in his private parts, which obviously is horrible, should not happen. But there's so much to cover when you're talking about the Ring Boy scandal. But one thing is for sure, that the way that this kind of came off was these were people who were close to Vince McMahon. These were people who were close to the power structure in WWE, who were part of the power structure in WWE. And these were people that Vince McMahon, was actively talking to and actively around. So the way the documentary kind of portrays it is Vince had to know something was up. And if he didn't, it was at worst negligence. If he did, it was at worst aiding and abetting. Either way, it's horrible. And obviously the Ring Boy scandal is something that is worth its own kind of discussion about, but it was one in a long line of horrible allegations against WWE officials at the time. And then we get into another horrible allegation, that of Rita Chatterton, the first ever female referee in WWF/WWE history, who was alleged to have been forced to give Vince McMahon oral sex in the back seat of a limo, at which point Vince McMahon forced himself on her. Rita Chatterton's allegations speak for themselves. We have discussed them on this channel before, so I won't go too deep into them. However, Vince did say in this documentary he flat out denied it, and he uttered a quote that was genuinely jarring and confusing to me, but also just as horrific when you think about it, because he flat out denies it. But then right after he finishes that sentence, he says, quote, "Had it been grape," I'm not going to say the word because had it been that, the statute of limitations have run out. Vince was responding to the allegation. That was his thing. Had it been that, the statute of limitations run out. So shoulder shrug. So to deny it is one thing, right? But to say that, well, even if I did it, statute of limitations run out, so whatever. It's horrible. And the thing to keep in mind here is in 2023, the state of New York, I believe, had lifted the statute of limitations for cases like these, and it ended with Vince McMahon settling with Rita Chatterton for an undisclosed amount. So seemed like Vince wanted to sweep that one under the rug the second the statute of limitations were no longer an issue. So goes on to say the press was very negative about her, and this is something that was covered in the documentary. Rita Chatterton was essentially just treated like trash by the media. She was on Geraldo, and Geraldo threw her under the bus. And this was obviously during a very different time, where before Me Too, before women's allegations were taken seriously, unfortunately. And it kind of goes to the media frenzy, and the way that many people still to this day kind of frame these allegations as women wanting attention. When you really think about it, though, who wants this level of attention? Who wants to be known as someone who is a victim of some of the most horrible and disgusting things that we can talk about? And at the end of the day, I think Rita Chatterton's allegations are something that, quite frankly, should have warned us for what was to come later on. After they discuss the scandals, they also discuss the fact that the negative press had built up. You had the steroid scandal, you had the Ring Boy scandal, you had the Rita Chatterton allegations, and this put immense pressure on Vince McMahon and the WWF, because in the eyes of the public, it had become not a burnt out and destroyed brand, but definitely a toxic brand in many ways. So to counteract that, Vince had decided to cater to a younger audience, to try to cater to the new generation, to cater to kids. And that's when you saw WWE kind of switch around and adjust their marketing to market more to kids. But the bad press for them is also kind of alienating fans of the more rough, edgy, and traditional style of professional wrestling. Opened up an opportunity for another wrestling company, that being WCW, to come into the fold. And episode 3 of this docuseries focused on the rise of WCW, the Montreal Screwjob as well, two of the most infamous moments in wrestling history. And you can't tell the story of Vince McMahon without telling these stories. And in this, they interviewed Eric Bischoff. Bischoff told the story about how he went to the studio where they were filming Hulk Hogan's TV show at the time, and he offered him a deal. He said, "You don't want to be on the road? That's fine. We're going to offer you guaranteed money, 30-something dates a year, and you're going to come to WCW." And Hogan accepted. And it was really funny because throughout this, Eric Bischoff was kind of telling the story of how his goal at the end of the day was kind of to get a reaction out of Vince, which is something that no one had really been able to do, especially on TV. No one had been able to get a reaction out of Vince. The whole thing was, and then the narrative was, he no sells everything, and that's what Pritchard said, that's what Hogan said, that's what everyone in this documentary said. Vince has a tendency, so he's not going to sell it, even if he's mad, he's not going to sell it. But Bischoff tells a story like, when I did Medusa throwing the title in the trash can, when I did Lex Luger signing up and joining WCW for the first ever Nitro, when I was giving away the results of Monday Night Raw live on TV, it was a lot of it to get a reaction out of Vince. And eventually they did through the Billionaire Ted skits. And Vince McMahon obviously did not like the way WCW was doing it. But evidently neither did USA Network like Vince's response, because they were the ones who actually put the kibosh on the Billionaire Ted character. Another component of this that was really interesting to me was the way Eric Bischoff kind of saw how Vince was framing things. Vince never framed things as, a head-to-head competition between Vince McMahon and Eric Bischoff. Vince always framed things as a head-to-head competition between Vince McMahon and Ted Turner. Billionaire Ted, this billionaire who has been in the media, he has a global conglomerate behind him, while he's just little old Vince McMahon. And the way Bischoff actually says this, and I think it's true, Vince in his mind was never competing with Eric, even though Eric was the one writing the TV, even though Eric was the one in charge, even though Ted Turner had nothing to do with WCW other than bankrolling it. Vince McMahon wanted to take on that challenge, and even in his head, that's what was motivating him the whole time. And Vince is like, and it tells you like the kind of guy Vince is. Like, Vince is the kind of guy, he's like, in his head, he's always spinning that storyline. He's always spinning that narrative, because that's what motivates him to do his job. The docuseries then went on to talk about the MSG incident. Vince, and this is the incident where that's also known as a curtain call, where Scott Hall, Kevin Nash were set to leave for WCW, but at Madison Square Garden house show, they embraced Shawn Michaels and Triple H, which is something that you didn't really see back in the day, and it obviously caused a big stir backstage. Wrestlers were unhappy. Mark Calloway, a.k.a. The Undertaker, was interviewed for this docuseries, and he even discussed how he was pissed about the way that this happened. And obviously, it also tells the story of Triple H getting punished for it, something we already know, but Vince defended it by saying, even though, I signed off on it, I probably shouldn't have. And at the end of the day, Triple H knew that he had to eat it. It'd be like that. Goes on to talking about the Montreal Screwjob as well. Not much that we learned about the Montreal Screwjob in particular. However, the only big, kind of controversy in this docuseries was how exactly the punching of Vince McMahon went down. Because one thing we know is after the Montreal Screwjob happened, after Vince McMahon had screwed Bret Hart out of the world title at Survivor Series 97, Vince McMahon was punched in the face by Bret Hart backstage. Bret Hart contends that Vince McMahon and him were kind of in a grappling match. They launched at each other, and they were kind of arguing or whatever, and Bret caught him with an uppercut. Vince's side, a.k.a. Pritchard, Triple H, and others allege that McMahon gave him a free shot. And obviously this is more of a petty thing or more than anything, but I mean, again, narratives over the years have been spun and controlled largely by the WWE infrastructure. So that's why a lot of people still to this day believe it was a free shot, even though Hart and others contend that it wasn't. So goes on to talk about the Attitude Era. This is where we get into episode 4, which, by the way, guys, if you haven't already, what are you waiting for? Smash that thumbs up, subscribe, hit that notification bell as we talk about episode 4, which did not, again, talk about things too in-depth farther than what we already know. We know the story of the Attitude Era, the rise of Vince McMahon, the promo where Vince came out in 1997 and said, "We know that you're tired of having your intelligence insulted. The traditional good guys versus bad guys." All that was covered. So was the rise of Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock. And this was during a time, obviously, where WWE was getting their ass kicked by WCW, but this is what led to the launch of the Attitude Era and a new kind of vibe around WWE. This was a time where WWE was able to use this newfound quote-unquote attitude that apparently, according to the docuseries, was launched by Shawn Michaels stuffing his crotch on TV. Vince McMahon trying to fine him $10,000, at which point Shawn talks him out of that and says, hey, look, if the ratings are up, you can fine me. And the ratings were up, and Vince kind of slowly but surely, kind of gradually bought into this idea of doing more racy and adult-themed storylines. And it worked, because after that, the 83-week win streak that Nitro was on ended, and we saw the Austin era begin. Stone Cold, The Rock, many others, and the the Mr. McMahon character all became prominent household figures in pro wrestling. And WWE at this point became unstoppable. We also got the interview with The Rock, which I wholeheartedly believe. Like, you could have told this same story of the Attitude Era without having The Rock as an interview, but this was their excuse to get The Rock as an interview, to be honest with you, which it is what it is. Rocky had to be in it. He's the board of directors of TKO. Shout out to him. In my notes, I also have all of this led to the rise of WWF, and they beat WCW. There were, however, negative components to the Attitude Era, which objectified women. And this is a theme that is prominent throughout the documentary, especially later on, where it talks about how Vince McMahon would objectify women, how Vince McMahon, when he brought back Sable after she sued the WWF for harassment, he brought her back in a storyline where he was having an affair with her. They cover the Trish Barking incident, one of the most infamous objectifications of women in wrestling history, and everything in between. And women were not treated as the athletes they are now, unfortunately. And a lot of it has to do with not only Vince McMahon and the direction WWE went to, but also, I think, kind of what Vince McMahon thought was good entertainment. And I think there's a correlation with the way Vince allegedly has treated women over the years and that objectification. That's just my opinion, but we'll have to talk more about that later on as we get into the finale of episode 3, which talks about the unfortunate the finale of episode 4, excuse me. We're doing it live. That talks about the untimely death of Owen Hart. Owen Hart obviously is one of the most beloved figures in the history of professional wrestling. And in the docuseries, it covers the Over the Edge 1999 accident that led to his death. And the docuseries actually focused on something that I have to give them credit for. It raised the question of why the show went on. This is something that people have been asking and demanding an answer for from Vince McMahon directly, and he addressed it. The idea of a wrestler dying in the ring is horrible in itself, but the idea of, after we know that he has died, they didn't make an announcement in the arena. They didn't, stop the show. The show went on, and they repeated it multiple times. Owen Hart's blood was right there, and the show went on. And it is horrible. It's genuinely horrible. Vince said that the show... Jesus. Vince, in this docuseries about this, after Owen Hart's death in the ring, said the show should have gone on. He defended saying the show should have gone on. Which, aside, let's take all the allegations, other things aside, this is a horrible thing to think, to still to this day defend. I think anyone in the right mind who knows that, knows that the wrestlers didn't want the show to go on. JR has said the show probably shouldn't have gone on. Many people have come out and said the show shouldn't have gone on. Fans don't think so. The only person who truly believes that is Vince McMahon. Is what it is. But that's where we get into episode 5, and it talks about more the McMahon family dynamic, and it covers how the McMahon family became more ingrained in the storylines of the WWE and how Linda McMahon was incorporated, all that. But it also talks about Vince's early life. It comes back to it and talks about the abuse that Vince McMahon himself suffered at the hands of not only his stepfather, but his mother as well. And Vince honestly has a very surprising and horrible line in this. Well, he has many horrible lines in this docuseries, but an alarming line where he said, he believes that, abuse, these things, they're just things that happen and you move forward. And he specifically in this mentions, incest as part of it kind of hearkening to his, upbringing, which is, horrible. There's no other way to put it. But he also follows that up by saying the tendency is that if you're abused as a kid, you're more likely to abuse. I don't subscribe to that. Which, obviously, given what we know and what has come out about Vince McMahon, very easy to see that that part is true. He does not subscribe to it. Goes on to talk about the dynamic within the family and how, as time went on, it felt like Shane McMahon specifically was being kind of put on the outs. He was almost the black sheep of the family. And Shane McMahon is a very interesting character in this, obviously, because he was at one point the heir apparent to Vince McMahon, but Vince kind of didn't like Shane's vibe. That's really what this came down to. Vince wanted Shane to work for it, but the way the docuseries kind of lays it out is Vince kind of saw himself more in Stephanie than in Shane McMahon, and that is what we've heard over the past 10, 15 years, this conversation ever since Shane left WWE in 2010 came out. It's that, it got to a point where Shane felt like nothing he could do is right. And to me, the most surprising thing in this docuseries that I found or that I came away with was this story that Paul Heyman told. Paul Heyman said that the Shane McMahon, Vince McMahon, tension kind of came to a head, and this is really what led to Shane McMahon leaving. And this is something I didn't know before. I just found out for the first time. He said that during a creative meeting, Shane McMahon had pitched an idea to Vince, and Vince had denied it as he normally does, and Shane was really fighting for this idea. Shane was adamant about this idea. He said it should move forward, and Vince McMahon, who was eating some food at the time, takes the knife he was eating the food with, points it over to Shane, gives it to him, and said, if you want to do that storyline, you're going to have to kill me, essentially. He said, if you want this, if you want the power to take control and say that that's what we're doing, you got to have the guts to kill me. You got to have the guts to do it. And that right there, I think, shows you it shows you kind of the generational impact that not only abuse and but also neglect from Vince Sr. can have. I think, Vince grew up in a quote-unquote tough environment, and he also believed in that type of tough love, if you can call it that. I mean, that story is insane, but it is what led to Vince leaving, Shane leaving and going about his business later on. But this was insane. This was an insane story, and again, it does speak to, I think, the way that he kind of treated his kids was a product in many ways of his early life as well. But that ends episode 4. We then get into episode 5, which goes into more scandals, but begins by talking about the billionaire matchup that Vince McMahon had with Donald Trump at WrestleMania 23, which led to Vince shaving his head. Talks about a very interesting dynamic where Donald Trump was kind of like a professional wrestling character who ran for president and brought pro wrestling and that kind of stuff into politics. Vince did not shy away from it. Obviously, Linda was a part of his administration, and so we know where those political allegiances lie. But it was interesting to hear that tidbit. But Brian Gewirtz, who was interviewed for this docuseries, also told the story like they had been pitching this idea of Vince, having a midlife crisis for a while and using the Vince McMahon character more sparingly in between. And one of the ways that Vince was like, well, you want my character seen less, just kill me off. And that's what they did. And apparently Donald Trump even called Vince McMahon's office because he thought that was real and was like, oh, is Vince okay? Hey, Vince, how are you doing, Vince? You doing okay, Vince? Okay, I just wanted to check in. Because apparently Trump thought that wrestling was real. Shout out to him. But shout out to him for nothing else. Anyway, coming out of that, obviously, more serious stuff happened because the night of the alleged Vince McMahon funeral was also the same night that we learned of Chris Benoit, Nancy Benoit, and their son Daniel dying. And at the time, obviously, it was unknown when Monday Night Raw went on the air what exactly happened. But about midway through the show, they found out the reality that Chris Benoit, former WWE World Heavyweight Champion, one of the best technical wrestlers of all time, a guy who was heralded by many of his wrestling peers, had murdered his child and his wife. And this became one of the biggest scandals in wrestling history. I'm not trying to, overshoot this or overstate this when I say this was something that genuinely could have brought down the entire industry. And it is something that, led to many fans leaving the product for a time. It is an incident that you can point to and say, like, this is when things really got bad for WWE in a PR sense. And it's part of a bigger reason why they eventually went PG, as covered in the docuseries. But the Benoit tragedy is again, a topic that's worthy of its own video one day. But it kind of, began the questioning of, like, why are wrestlers dying so young? And Vince McMahon was pressed on this in the docuseries. Vince became very defiant at the time. He was giving all these interviews, as told in the documentary, to Today's Show, saying, fighting against this narrative that it was steroids, that it was roid rage. And many wrestlers as well agree, like, roid rage does not make you do the things that Chris Benoit did. It does not. It had to be something deeper. They bring in Chris Nowinski for the docuseries. Chris Nowinski, for those you don't know, former Harvard graduate who was a pro wrestler whose career actually ended due to concussions. He was the person who was part of a team that studied Chris Benoit's brain, and it was found that he had a very severe case of CTE. And, that excessive brain damage to the head is what led to these actions. And CTE is something that's been covered in the NFL. It's been talked about in the NHL, MLB, all these major sports where you are taking these big hits or, you're under the threat of a lot of brain injury. You, like there's always that threat. So these things are always been talked about. And Chris Nowinski basically said, like, Chris Benoit had, like, the brain of an 80-year-old. And it is, something that WWE eventually kind of led into and said, well, okay, we need to change. That's when you saw chair shots go away. And Mark Calloway even said, like, I'm a bit of an old school guy. I was kind of mad when I saw chair shots go away, but it was what was best for business. And again, I think the overall takeaway from this, from a Vince standpoint, was, Vince felt like this was another moment where not only he was under attack, but his company was under attack. Because for Vince, the company and he are one. If he's being attacked, that means the company is under attack. If the company is under attack, that means he's being attacked. And he felt like this was another, like, very challenging moment for him, which, quite frankly, it was for the entire company. The docuseries then goes on to talk about people's feelings around Vince. And Vince McMahon was treated as a father figure by many. Trish Stratus, John Cena, Undertaker, all in his docuseries claimed that Vince and him had a fatherly relationship with them. Shane McMahon's return was also covered. He worked very hard to earn his father's respect, and he felt like in that second run when he returned in 2016, he got that. Then it was the kicker. They were talking about Vince retiring, and this is how we kind of end episode 5. Vince McMahon, like, do you see yourself retiring? The question was asked him straight up, and he said, I never see myself retiring. I never understood why people stop growing. When you stop growing, you die. And it ends on this note. Booker T answering the question, what would it take for Vince to retire? And Booker answers, what do I think it would take for Vince to retire? A nuclear bomb exploding. And we get a montage of some of the allegations and reports that came out in that 2022 Wall Street Journal piece. And that's how we end episode 5. We go into episode 6, the final episode of this series, talking about Vince McMahon and the allegations stemming from 2023. Now, this one begins with them talking, them being many people in the media who were interviewed for this, like kind of everything that led up to this news breaking. And Meltzer, say what you want about Dave Meltzer, like genuinely, say what you want about Dave Meltzer. I know that he's a very controversial figure, but he did bring up a very good point here. Meltzer claims that whatever you, he explained, whatever you think of Vince, he expected Vince to go after the reporters for this piece. When this Wall Street Journal piece came out about the hush money payments, he expected reporters to go after the people around this piece the second the scandal dropped, because if he had any sort of defense at all in the past, as he's done, Vince would go after the reporters' credibility, and it was very telling that he didn't. And everything we've seen about Vince McMahon, very defiant in the face of people attacking him in his view. He's very defiant in whenever people, try to hold him accountable, anything. He's always defiant. And this was one place and one time we heard virtually nothing. The most we got was Vince showing up on Monday Night Raw and Friday Night SmackDown to open the shows. And it was a bit of an FU to those reporters and to the allegations. However, there was no effort publicly to, outside of that, to really go after and negate the reports. And to me, and as someone who works in PR, that is a telling piece. The Docuseries then chronicles the other allegations against Vince McMahon. A 2006 tanning salon allegation from a woman who claims that Vince McMahon groped her. Vince McMahon then followed up with a storyline a week later where Mickie James was playing a character who was making false allegations against the man. Again, the idea there is that Vince McMahon, that was his way of combating that allegation. There was also $12 million paid to 4 different women to cover up allegations of misconduct, some of which the allegations are actually more serious than the Janelle Grant lawsuit, which was filed earlier this year. $7.5 million was paid to a former female wrestler who allegedly was assaulted by Vince McMahon. Dunn talks about Vince's retirement and kind of discusses an interesting piece, the overstated nature of Vince's departure and then the impact it would have. I always said that Vince McMahon retiring from pro wrestling was the biggest story in the history of pro wrestling. Genuinely, the biggest story in the history of pro wrestling. And I still stand by it because of who Vince McMahon is in the larger story of wrestling, and especially the way it happened. Regardless, the impact that it had on the business, I mean, it had a huge impact. I don't think it was to the degree that many people thought it would be, or in the way that many people thought it would be. The business didn't go down, it went up. It got a lot better for WWE after Vince was out of the picture. But, as we know, in January 2023, he worked his way back in. This coincided in a time where Stephanie McMahon and Paul Levesque were put into creative and executive positions in the company, and Stephanie McMahon actually resigned the day after Vince came back. The doc did allude to the idea that Vince was talked into quitting back in June of 2022, by someone close to him, and that it was implied that that person was Stephanie. Then talks about the Janelle Grant lawsuit, Vince McMahon resigning one day later, and they then get into a allegation that you don't hear too much about, but you did when the original Janelle Grant piece came out. The lawsuit, I mean, it brought back the allegation or a statement, excuse me, from Ashley Massaro, a former WWE star who took her own life in 2019, and it claimed that before her death, Vince McMahon made advances to her when she was a WWE star, and Vince McMahon, after Ashley had said no and relented, had embarrassed her on TV, which there are segments where that did happen. And WWE also allegedly knew about an assault that took place on her on a Tribute to the Troops show, and like that has been covered as well. And again, speaks to a culture, I think, within WWE under Vince McMahon, culture where women were not only objectified, but in many cases they were unsafe. And I think that is a theme that you see throughout this documentary. Is the story is about Vince McMahon, but the impact that he has had on people in a negative way is something you don't hear talked about as much as it probably should. And it's one of the reasons why Vince McMahon is such a toxic figure for many wrestling fans. Like, this is someone who, if you're looking, it's not just one or two allegations. It's not just people looking for attention. This is Vince McMahon and what's outlined not only in this documentary, like forget the docuseries, but throughout the history of his life and career. It is clear that there's a pattern. There is a pattern of behavior that is not only alarming, but quite frankly disturbing, beyond the Janelle Grant lawsuit, beyond the Ashley Massaro allegation, beyond even the Rita Chatterton allegation. At worst, Vince McMahon is, or at best, Vince McMahon is one of the biggest, most abusive bullies we've ever seen in as position of power that he is in professional wrestling. And at worst, he's a monster. And I think one thing that the docuseries kind of outlined pretty well was kind of that, and talking about that. The docuseries then goes on to end with a quote about from Vince McMahon, excuse me, saying that the character blends in with the guy, like the man who's playing him, and like that's kind of like the whole idea of like, if you're a wrestling character, you kind of are an amalgamation of the real person that is playing you. And the idea that Netflix tried to get across that I don't think was as effective as it was the idea that Vince McMahon had become lost in the sauce. I mean, there are elements to that are true, but I don't think that the things that Vince McMahon is accused of in the track record and pattern of abuse that we've kind of witnessed around him, I don't think that is something that can be chalked up to him getting lost in the sauce or the character Mr. McMahon being blended with the guy Vince McMahon. It's just who Vince is. Because these are allegations that stem back to the 1980s. Like, these are not new things. They're not things that happened after the Mr. McMahon character came into prominence in 97. So I think that premise of the docuseries kind of fails for me. But I do think if you are someone who, did not know a lot about the history of Vince McMahon, the rise of WWF into WWE and all that, it's a great primer for wrestling fans who want that. And I don't think that there was like a side that was kind of like unturned. Obviously, Bruce Pritchard, Triple H, and Hulk Hogan paint a very glowing picture of Vince McMahon, the guy. And I'm sure many of them have great experiences with Vince. And mind you, most of these interviews were carried out prior to the original Wall Street Journal report in June 2022 coming out. But Pritchard did actually have a follow-up in the days before the Janelle Grant lawsuit came up in January of this year, where he was, essentially saying like, you guys, because he had seen some episodes that were early produced of the docuseries, and he felt like it was, wrong. He felt like they didn't capture the human side of Vince McMahon. And again, it's 2 days later. We saw the news of the Janelle Grant lawsuit come out, and you could argue that they could have talked more about the human side of Vince, but you can only speak about these things as much as, the person will let you. And Vince even said, like, I'm not going to let you guys in too much. I'm just going to give you enough to tell this story. So at the end of the day, I thought that this was, an informative piece. Again, a lot of this is stuff that if you're a wrestling fan who's been paying attention, watching videos and all that kind of stuff, you probably know a lot of it. But I do think the insight from the other people is very important as well. But guys, that was me blabbing my way through breaking down the Mr. McMahon docuseries. Again, I do recommend everyone go check it out. It is, I think, pretty well done by Netflix. Now, the question is, what is next? Vince McMahon is, waiting. The trial the Janelle Grant trial, is on hold pending a federal investigation into trafficking on him. And does not look good for Vince. That is also like how the docuseries ended. But guys, if you've seen it, let me know what you think about it in the comment section below. Also, be sure, if you haven't already done so, to smash that thumbs up, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you get notified whenever a new video is released. I'm Omer Q for Real Take Wrestling. Be happy, be healthy, and as always, keep it real.